April 30th, 1945, 10:50 p.m. The Reichstag building, Berlin. Sergeant Mikhail Yegorov is climbing through smoke and darkness up a marble staircase slick with blood. Machine gun fire echoes through the corridors. Somewhere above him, SS troops are firing down through the railings. The body of a Soviet lieutenant is sprawled across the landing ahead. The air smells like cordite and burning wood. Yegorov has a red flag in his pack. Not the official Soviet banner. That one. A flag sewn from 3 red tablecloths by a photographer's uncle in Moscow. This is not the moment you think it is. The most famous photograph of World War II, the image that defined victory in Europe, was completely staged. Shot 2 days later with random soldiers, not the heroes. One of them was wearing 2 wristwatches. Moscow airbrushed it out. But before we get to the lie that became history, we need to understand the truth. How did a battle that lasted just 17 days kill over 500,000 people and become the bloodiest urban combat in human history? To understand how the Battle of Berlin became an apocalypse, you need to understand where the world was in April 1945 and what was about to collide. Spring 1945. The Third Reich is dying. The Red Army has pushed 2,500 kilometers west from Stalingrad. American and British forces have crossed the Rhine. Germany is being crushed between 2 million-man armies. But there was a problem. Nobody had decided who would take Berlin. On the western side, General Eisenhower has halted his forces at the Elbe River, 100 kilometers from Berlin. General Omar Bradley has calculated it would cost 100,000 American casualties to capture a city that will end up in the Soviet occupation zone anyway. His exact words: a pretty stiff price to pay for a prestige objective. On the eastern side, Joseph Stalin. And Stalin doesn't care about the cost, because this isn't about military necessity. The war is already won. This is about something else entirely. Who gets to stand on Hitler's grave? Who gets to raise their flag over the Reichstag? Who writes the story of victory? It was David versus Goliath. Except both sides were Goliath. And Berlin, with 2.8 million civilians still trapped inside, was caught between them. And worse, the environment was urban warfare at its most brutal. A city of 883 square kilometers, buildings turned into fortresses. Every intersection mined, every basement a bunker. The subway tunnels packed with civilians seeking shelter. The Berlin Zoo's exotic animals, wandering streets cratered by bombs. Elephants, apes, birds of prey, starving or shot by frightened soldiers. This wasn't just a battle. It was the end of the world, compressed into 17 days. And in the middle of that apocalypse was not one man, but millions. Let me introduce you to 4 of them. First, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, 48 years old, 5'7", barrel-chested, with a face like carved granite. If you saw him in a photograph, which millions of Soviets did, you wouldn't think he was a farmer's son from a village so poor his family couldn't afford shoes. You'd think he was exactly what Stalin had made him, the Soviet Union's greatest general, the man who saved Moscow, the man who broke the siege of Leningrad, the man who would take Berlin or die trying. Second, General Helmuth Weidling, 50 years old, Prussian, dignified, one of the Wehrmacht's finest defensive commanders. On April 23, 1945, Hitler appointed him commander of Berlin's defense. His response when he heard the news: "You might just as well have me shot." Third, a boy, no name recorded, maybe 13, maybe 15 years old, wearing a Wehrmacht uniform 4 sizes too large, lying in a shallow trench on the outskirts of Berlin, clutching a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon. Tears running down his face. His orders: wait for Soviet tanks, run underneath them, detonate the weapon. It's a suicide mission. He knows it. Behind him, SS squads are hanging deserters from lampposts with signs around their necks. I was too cowardly to defend the fatherland. Fourth, Dorothea von Schwanenflugel, a young German woman, a civilian, trapped in the city with her mother. She will see the boy soldier. She will walk past his trench. She will want to help him, and she won't be able to do anything because the punishment for helping a deserter is the same as desertion. These four people, the marshal, the general, the boy, the witness, came from different worlds. Zhukov was born in 1896 in Strelkovka, a village so remote it didn't appear on most maps. His family was peasant class, dirt poor. He worked as a furrier's apprentice in Moscow before World War I, sleeping in a workshop, sending money home. When the revolution came, he joined the Red Army because it was that or starve. Weidling was born into the Prussian military tradition. His father was an officer, proper education, military academy. He fought in World War I as a young lieutenant, watched Germany's humiliation at Versailles, and stayed in the drastically reduced Reichswehr during the 1920s, out of duty, not ambition. The boy, let's call him Hans because there were thousands of Hans, was probably born in the late 1920s or early 1930s. He grew up in Hitler's Germany, the only Germany he knew. The Hitler Youth wasn't optional. The propaganda wasn't something you questioned. And when the Red Army reached the Oder River, 60 kilometers from Berlin, men in uniforms came to his school and handed him a Panzerfaust and an oversized helmet and told him he was now a soldier. Dorothea von Schwanenflügel was born into Berlin's middle class. Her father died before the war. She and her mother survived the British bombing raids of 1943 and 1944, the nights spent in shelters while the city burned above them. She was 20-something in April 1945, trying to survive, trying to find food, trying not to think about what was coming. Zhukov learned war because the alternative was obscurity, or worse, death during Stalin's purges. Survival in the Red Army meant victories. Defeats meant a bullet. Weidling learned defense because Germany kept losing, and somebody had to organize the retreats. By 1945, he was an expert at making bad positions last days longer than they should. The boy learned to use the Panzerfaust because grown men with guns told him if he didn't, he'd be shot. Or the Bolsheviks would get his mother. Or both. Dorothea learned to keep silent, keep moving, keep her eyes down, because that's how civilian women survived wars started by men. The Red Army taught Zhukov tactics. Stalin taught Zhukov ruthlessness. The Tsarist conscription system taught Zhukov discipline. But poverty, the kind where you choose between bread and shoes, taught Zhukov hunger, the kind you never forget. And that hunger made him willing to spend lives like currency if it meant victory. The Wehrmacht taught Weidling strategy. The Eastern Front taught Weidling flexibility. Prussian tradition taught Weidling honor. But 4 years of retreat from Moscow to Berlin taught Weidling futility. And that futility made him the perfect commander for a doomed city, someone who would fight brilliantly for a cause he knew was already lost. The Wehrmacht made these boys soldiers, but Nazi Germany made them sacrifices. And in April 1945, when Zhukov was 48 years old, he had been fighting for almost 4 years straight. From 1941 to 1945, he commanded the defense of Moscow, the relief of Leningrad, the counteroffensive at Kursk, Operation Bagration across Belarusia, the Vistula-Oder offensive through Poland. He had commanded millions of men. He had beaten the Wehrmacht across 2,500 kilometers. And in each of these campaigns, Zhukov used the same technique, overwhelming force, artillery barrages that turned the earth inside out, tank armies that rolled over defensive positions like steel tsunamis. If the cost was 50,000 Soviet lives to take a city, that was acceptable, because Stalin accepted it, because the alternative, failure, was worse than death. The Red Army taught him to attack, but Stalin had taught him that there was always a rival watching, always someone ready to replace him if he stumbled. And in April 1945, that rival had a name, Marshal Ivan Konev. And on April 1, 1945, all of these tensions, the military, the political, the personal, would converge in a single meeting. On the morning of April 1st, Zhukov wasn't supposed to be worried about competition. He was supposed to be planning the greatest offensive of his career, the assault on Berlin. He commanded the First Belarusian Front, nearly 1 million men, directly east of the German capital. But when he arrived at the Kremlin, he saw something that made his blood freeze. Marshal Ivan Konev was there too. Konev commanded the First Ukrainian Front, south of Zhukov's position. His job was to support Zhukov's main assault, protect his flank, and let Zhukov take the glory. That's what the plan had been. Stalin had different ideas. He spread a map across the table. Zhukov and Konev stood on opposite sides, like boxers at a weigh-in. Stalin drew boundary lines between their fronts with a red pencil. Then he did something extraordinary. He stopped the line at Lubin, 50 miles short of Berlin. The message was crystal clear. Whoever got there first would take the capital. Stalin looked up at both marshals and asked a single question. Who will take Berlin, us or the Allies? Konev answered immediately. We will, and before the Allies. It was a race, not just against the Americans, against each other. And everyone in that room knew what that meant. One of them would become immortal as the conqueror of Berlin. The other would be forgotten, or worse. Zhukov and Konev had been rivals since 1939. Now Stalin had weaponized that rivalry and aimed it at the German capital. For the assault on Berlin, Zhukov assembled the largest concentration of firepower in military history. 2.5 million men across 3 Soviet fronts, 6,250 tanks and self-propelled guns, 41,600 artillery pieces and mortars, 7,500 aircraft, and 7 million artillery shells stockpiled, enough to fire continuously for days. But the most unusual weapon was this: 143 searchlights, massive anti-aircraft searchlights, repositioned to face forward. The plan was to turn them on right before the infantry assault, blinding the German defenders and illuminating targets for Soviet troops. It was brilliant, in theory. The first obstacle wasn't Berlin itself. It was the Seelow Heights, a ridge 48 meters above the Oder floodplain, 90 kilometers east of Berlin, the last defensive line before the capital. General Gotthard Heinrici commanded the defense. He was known as the Wehrmacht's greatest defensive expert, and he had prepared something special. Heinrici had flooded the approaches to the heights by releasing water from reservoirs. The Soviet advance would have to cross marshy ground, fully exposed, while German artillery fired down from elevated positions. And he'd done something else, something that would infuriate Zhukov and cost thousands of Soviet lives. April 16, 1945. 5 a.m. The attack begins. Zhukov's artillery opened fire, 9,000 guns and rocket launchers, over 500,000 shells in the first 30 minutes. The sound was reported as far away as Berlin, a continuous thunder that shook the ground. Trees vaporized, buildings collapsed into rubble. The earth itself seemed to be screaming. Then, at exactly 5 a.m., the searchlights clicked on. 143 beams of white light stabbed forward through the darkness, illuminating the battlefield like a stadium. It was supposed to blind the Germans. And here's the trick. It backfired completely. The searchlights reflected off the smoke and dust from the artillery barrage, creating a glowing fog that hung in the air. Soviet infantry advancing across the floodplain couldn't see more than a few meters ahead. They stumbled forward in confusion, silhouetted against the light, perfect targets. And worse, the German front-line trenches were empty. Heinrici had pulled his troops back during the night. He'd left skeleton crews to hold the forward positions, but evacuated the main force to the second defensive line, beyond the range of the opening bombardment. When Soviet infantry reached the German trenches, expecting to find dead defenders, they found nothing. Then the German artillery opened fire from the heights. Soviet troops were caught in the open. In daylight, the sun had risen, on flooded ground, advancing uphill against prepared positions. Zhukov watched from his forward command post and realized with growing horror that his brilliant plan was failing. By noon on April 16th, Soviet forces had advanced less than 5 kilometers. They'd taken the first line, empty trenches. The second and third lines were still intact, and German defenders were cutting down Soviet infantry in waves. Stalin telephoned that evening. "Are you sure you can take Berlin?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Zhukov was one of the few men who dared argue with Stalin, but even he knew the danger. If he failed, Konev would take the capital, and Zhukov would be finished. So he made a decision that violated his own doctrine and would cost thousands of Soviet lives. He committed his tank armies. Tank armies are supposed to exploit breakthroughs, not create them. You use infantry and artillery to break through defensive lines, then unleash the tanks to drive deep into enemy territory. But Zhukov was desperate, and he was competing with Konev, whose forces were advancing faster in the south. So on April 17th, hundreds of Soviet tanks drove straight at the Seelow heights. They bogged down in the marshy ground. German Panzerfaust teams, soldiers with handheld anti-tank weapons, including boys like our hypothetical Hans, stalked between the burning wrecks, firing rockets at point-blank range. For 3 days, April 16th through April 18th, the Battle of Seelow Heights ground forward. Soviet artillery fired over 1 million shells. T-34 tanks littered the approaches, burning. Bodies piled up in the flooded ditches. But mass eventually beat skill. By April 19th, Zhukov's forces had broken through all 3 German defensive lines. Heinrich's men retreated toward Berlin. The path was open. The cost? Approximately 30,000 Soviet soldiers killed in 4 days. German losses, about 12,000 killed. And here's the critical detail. Konev's First Ukrainian Front, advancing from the south, was making better progress. Stalin called Konev and gave him permission to redirect forces toward Berlin. The race was on, but there was a problem. Berlin wasn't empty. Berlin had 2.8 million civilians trapped inside, and General Helmuth Weidling, remember him, the man who said, "You might just as well have me shot," had just been handed an impossible task. April 20th, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday. Soviet artillery, now within range, began shelling central Berlin. Hitler emerged from his bunker for the last time. Newsreel cameras filmed him shuffling through the Reich Chancellery garden, his left hand trembling uncontrollably, awarding Iron Crosses to Hitler Youth boys, some as young as 12 years old. The radio broadcasts called them volunteers. Dorothea von Schwanenflügel, watching this scene play out across Berlin, later described it as a cruel lie, because boys found hiding were hanged as traitors by roving SS and Gestapo gangs. These children, some so young they could barely lift the Panzerfaust weapons, were being fed into the defense of Berlin. Not because they could win, but because admitting defeat was unthinkable to the men in the bunker. Hitler, during his daily military conference on April 22nd, had a complete breakdown. His generals reported that Soviet forces were advancing from the north, east, and south. The encirclement of Berlin was nearly complete. They begged him to flee south to Bavaria, to the Alpine Redoubt, where German forces could continue the fight. Hitler screamed that the war was lost, that everyone had betrayed him, that he would stay in Berlin and shoot himself. Then he did something no one expected. He meant it. Most dictators, when facing defeat, flee. Hitler stayed. Weidling, newly appointed as Berlin's commander on April 23rd, looked at what he had to work with. 45,000 Wehrmacht soldiers in the city. 60,000 Volkssturm, the militia, men aged 16 to 60, given rifles and told to hold the line. Well, now in 500 tanks and armored vehicles, most broken down, out of fuel, or obsolete. Against him, 2.5 million Soviet troops, 6,250 tanks, and unlimited artillery ammunition. He divided the city into 8 defensive sectors, labeled A through H Government District, where Hitler's bunker was located, became Sector Z, defended by about 2,000 men under SS Brigade Führer Wilhelm Mohnke. Weidling knew the truth. Berlin would fall. The only question was how long he could delay it and how many would die in the process. On April 24th, Soviet forces completed the encirclement of Berlin. The city was cut off. On April 25th, the same day American and Soviet forces met at Torgau on the Elbe River, cutting Germany in two. The street fighting in Berlin intensified. And here's where the battle became truly nightmarish. Urban warfare is unlike any other kind of combat. Every building is a fortress. Every window is a firing position. Every basement is a bunker. Soldiers fight room to room, floor to floor. You clear one building, move to the next, and find the building you just cleared has been reoccupied behind you. Soviet tactics were brutal and effective. Artillery would blast a building until the upper floors collapsed. Tanks would fire point-blank into ground floor windows. Infantry would storm in with submachine guns and grenades. Clear the basement. Move to the next building. Repeat. German defenders used every advantage of the urban terrain. They blocked streets with rubble, mined intersections, set up interlocking fields of fire so every avenue of approach was covered by multiple machine guns. Hitler ordered the flooding of Berlin's subway tunnels, ostensibly to slow Soviet movement, but actually killing thousands of civilians sheltering below. Approximately 25% of the U-Bahn was flooded. Survivors described water rising in the darkness, crushing crowds at the exits, bodies floating. The Berlin Zoo became a battlefield. Exotic animals, elephants, apes, birds of prey, wandered through cratered streets. Some were shot by frightened soldiers. Some starved. An elephant was found dead with shrapnel wounds near the Tiergarten. One of the few massive structures that held out was the Zoo Flak Tower, a 70-meter by 70-meter concrete fortress, 39 meters tall, with 4 twin 128mm anti-aircraft guns on the roof. It sheltered 30,000 civilians and priceless museum treasures, including the bust of Nefertiti. Its walls were 3 meters thick. Soviet artillery couldn't penetrate it. Soviet commanders chose to bypass it, rather than waste men trying to take it. It wouldn't surrender until May 2nd, and after the war, it took 35 tons of explosives to demolish. But most of Berlin wasn't fortified like the Flak Tower. Most of Berlin was apartment buildings full of terrified civilians, soldiers who wanted to surrender but couldn't because the SS was executing deserters, and boys like Hans with Panzerfausts they barely knew how to operate. Dorothea von Schwanenflügel recorded her experiences. She wrote about walking through streets littered with bodies, about the constant artillery fire, the way buildings would collapse without warning, burying whoever was inside. She wrote about the smell, cordite, smoke, sewage, and decay. She wrote about finding the boy soldier in his trench, tears running down his face, and being unable to help him because the SS were watching. And she wrote about what came next, the thing that would haunt Berlin for generations. By April 29th, Soviet forces had penetrated to the city center. Hitler's bunker was less than a kilometer from the front lines. The sound of artillery and small arms fire was constant. In the bunker, Hitler married Eva Braun after midnight. He dictated his final political testament, naming Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor. He blamed everyone, the generals, the German people, the Jews, for the defeat. He took responsibility for nothing. On April 30th, at approximately 3:30 p.m., Adolf Hitler shot himself. Eva Braun took cyanide. Their bodies were carried up to the Reich Chancellery Garden, doused with gasoline, and burned. The Reich was leaderless. But the fighting continued, because Stalin had given one specific symbolic objective to his commanders: capture the Reichstag. The Reichstag building, the old German parliament, hadn't been used for its original purpose since 1933, when it burned in the mysterious fire that helped Hitler consolidate power. By 1945, it was a shell, windows bricked up, interior gutted and turned into a defensive maze of barricades, firing positions, and booby traps. Defended by about 1,000 troops, SS soldiers, Hitler Youth, and Kriegsmarine sailors pulled from their coastal postings. But it was symbolic. It represented German parliamentary democracy. And Stalin wanted the Soviet flag flying over it before May 1st. May Day, the international workers' holiday. The propaganda value was immeasurable. Soviet Third Shock Army under Colonel General Kuznetsov was given the honor. The 150th and 171st Rifle Divisions would lead the assault. The route: cross the Moltke Bridge over the Spree River, just 600 meters from the Reichstag, then assault across the open Königsplatz, now Platz der Republik. The bridge was mined. German defenders had wired it with explosives. On April 29th, when Soviet troops approached, the Germans detonated the charges. The bridge didn't collapse. The explosives damaged it, blew chunks out of the roadway, but the main span held. Soviet infantry crossed under machine gun and artillery fire. Bodies fell into the Spree. The survivors made it across and took cover in the ruined buildings on the western bank. That evening, Soviet assault groups stormed the Reichstag. This wasn't a conventional battle. This was building to building, floor to floor, room to room combat in a structure turned into a fortress. German defenders had the high ground, upper floors, roof positions. Soviet attackers had to fight upward through narrow staircases and corridors, every corner a potential ambush. Flamethrowers, grenades. Submachine gun bursts echoing through marble halls. The building filled with smoke. Fires started on multiple floors. Soviet soldiers from the 150th Rifle Division, many of them volunteers who'd fought since Stalingrad, pushed toward the roof. That's where the flag needed to go. That's what Stalin wanted to see in the photographs. At approximately 10:50 p.m. on April 30th, 1945, two Soviet soldiers, Sergeant Mikhail Yegorov and Sergeant Meliton Kantaria, reached the roof and raised the Soviet victory banner. This is the official story. Yegorov and Kantaria became heroes of the Soviet Union. Their names went into history books. But here's what actually happened, or at least what historians now believe happened. Multiple flags were raised on the Reichstag during April 30th and May 1st. Different units, different times. The fighting inside the building continued through the night and into May 1st. German defenders in the basement didn't surrender until the morning of May 2nd. The official flag raising at 10:50 p.m. was likely one of several, and it definitely wasn't the photograph. The famous photograph, the one you've seen in every World War II documentary, the one in every history textbook, was taken on May 2nd, 1945, 2 days after the official flag raising. Yevgeny Khaldei, a Soviet war photographer, arrived at the Reichstag with a flag his uncle had sewn from 3 red tablecloths back in Moscow. He recruited soldiers he found near the building, not Yegorov and Kantaria, and had them climb to the roof. He posed them raising the flag. Multiple times, different angles, getting the composition just right. Soldier silhouetted against the sky, flag billowing, ruined Berlin spreading below. Then he noticed something in the developed prints. One of the soldiers was wearing a wristwatch on each wrist, evidence of looting which would undermine the heroic narrative. Soviet censors airbrushed out the extra watch before the photograph was published. So the most iconic image of Allied victory in World War II, the moment that symbolized the fall of Nazi Germany, was completely staged 2 days after the fact, with substitute soldiers, and then edited to remove evidence of war crimes. History isn't what happened. History is the photograph someone chose to publish. The real battle of the Reichstag was chaos. Multiple Soviet units fighting simultaneously. No clear chain of command. Officers competing for glory. Soldiers taking what they could from the ruins. And German defenders, including teenagers, fighting to the death, because surrender meant Soviet captivity, which, given what the Wehrmacht had done in Russia, was a terrifying prospect. The Reichstag assault killed hundreds of Soviet soldiers and hundreds of German defenders. For a building that had no military value whatsoever. For a symbol. May 1st, 1945. Hitler was dead. The Reichstag had fallen. The Reich Chancellery was burning. At 3 a.m., General Hans Krebs, who spoke fluent Russian, arrived at General Vasily Chuikov's headquarters under a white flag. Chuikov was the legendary defender of Stalingrad. His 8th Guards Army had fought through Berlin street by street. He'd earned the right to accept the German surrender. Krebs informed Chuikov that Hitler was dead. Then he tried to negotiate terms. Chuikov's response was immediate. Unconditional surrender. No negotiations, no terms. Surrender or die. Krebs went back to report. The men in the bunker, Goebbels, Bormann, the remaining staff, refused. They still believed some miracle might save them, or perhaps they simply couldn't imagine surrender. That afternoon, Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, newly appointed Reich Chancellor, the man whose speeches had promised total victory, made his final decision. He and his wife Magda poisoned their 6 children: Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Hulda, Hedda, and Haida. Ages 12 down to 4. They were given morphine to make them drowsy, then crushed cyanide capsules were placed in their mouths. Then Josef and Magda Goebbels went up to the garden and committed suicide. The children's bodies were found later by Soviet soldiers in the bunker, still in their beds. That night, remnants of the Berlin garrison attempted a mass breakout. The plan was to fight westward, break through Soviet, Encirclement, and surrender to the Americans or British. Better Western captivity than Soviet. Thousands of German soldiers, mixed with some civilians, tried to escape through the subway tunnels and across the Charlottenbrücke Bridge. Most were killed or captured. Soviet forces had the routes covered. Only small groups succeeded. Those who moved in the darkness, avoiding main streets, crossing the Spree at unexpected points. At 6 a.m. on May 2, 1945, General Helmuth Weidling, the man who'd commanded Berlin's defense for 9 days, surrendered to General Chuikov. At 8:23 a.m., Weidling issued formal surrender orders to all remaining German forces in Berlin. On April 30th, the Führer committed suicide and thus abandoned those who had sworn loyalty to him. According to the Führer's order, you German soldiers would have had to go on fighting for Berlin, despite the fact that our ammunition has run out, and despite the general situation which makes our further resistance meaningless. I order the immediate cessation of resistance. By 3 p.m., Soviet artillery fell silent. The Battle of Berlin was over. 17 days, April 16th to May 2nd, 1945. Soviet forces, 81,000 to 100,000 killed, 280,000 wounded. Total casualties, approximately 350,000 to 365,000. German forces, 92,000 to 100,000 killed, 480,000 captured. Berlin civilians, estimates range from 22,000 to 125,000 killed. Total, over 500,000 casualties. John Erickson, the historian, wrote that the battle cost 500,000 beings their lives, their well-being, or their sanity. Equipment losses. Soviet forces lost approximately 2,000 tanks. The Germans lost whatever they had left. By May 2nd, Berlin's defenders were fighting with bolt-action rifles and Panzerfausts. But numbers don't capture the reality. The mass rape of German women by Soviet soldiers has been called the greatest phenomenon of mass rape in history. Historian Antony Beevor estimates 100,000 women in Berlin, with estimates ranging up to 2 million across all of Germany. Victims ranged from 8 years old to 80 years old. Soviet war correspondent Natalia Gessi recorded testimony. Hospital records documented the aftermath. Some Soviet commanders tried to impose discipline. General Nikolai Berzarin, appointed first Soviet commandant of Berlin, imposed death penalties for rape and looting. Records show 4,148 Red Army officers were punished. But enforcement was inconsistent and much was ignored. Contributing factors identified by historians: years of Soviet hate propaganda, personal trauma from German atrocities during the invasion of Russia, dehumanizing imagery, widespread alcohol consumption, and the particular rage of former Soviet POWs who'd survived German camps. Soviet propaganda had told soldiers for 4 years that Germans were subhuman. German propaganda had told civilians for 4 years that Soviets were subhuman. When those two dehumanized armies collided in Berlin, the result was predictable. And it was a horror. Dorothea von Schwanenflügel survived. She fled Berlin after the surrender, eventually immigrating to the United States. She wrote her memoir decades later, recording what she'd witnessed. General Weidling surrendered honorably. He was taken to Soviet captivity, where he died in 1955. General Berzarin, who tried to restore order and organized food distribution to starving civilians, was killed in a motorcycle accident on June 16, 1945, just 55 days after his appointment. Berlin made him an honorary citizen in 2003. Marshal Zhukov got his victory. He became the Soviet military governor of Germany. But Stalin, jealous of his popularity, sidelined him after the war. Zhukov survived Stalin's death and was rehabilitated under Khrushchev. He died in 1974, never having written honestly about the cost of Berlin. Marshal Konev, who'd raced Zhukov to Berlin, was redirected to Prague at the last moment when Stalin drew a boundary line giving Zhukov the honor of the capital. Konev took Prague instead. He survived to become a marshal of the Soviet Union, later infamous for suppressing the 1956 Hungarian uprising. He died in 1973. The boy, Hans or whatever his name was, probably died. Most of the Hitler Youth and Volkssturm defenders did. Their bodies were buried in mass graves or never identified. So what does it mean? 500,000 people dead, a city destroyed, a war that was already won, extended for weeks at catastrophic cost. Was it necessary? From a purely military standpoint, no. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, 6 days after Berlin fell. Germany's military was already destroyed. Hitler was going to die in his bunker, whether Berlin fell on May 2nd or May 22nd. General Eisenhower calculated that taking Berlin would cost 100,000 American casualties for a city that would end up in the Soviet occupation zone anyway. He halted at the Elbe and let the Soviets pay the price. Churchill disagreed violently. He saw Berlin as essential for post-war political positioning. He was right. The Cold War began at Yalta and Potsdam, and whoever controlled Germany's capital would shape Europe's future. But militarily, Berlin didn't matter. The Wehrmacht was finished. The question was only how many people would die before the formality of surrender. From a political standpoint, it was inevitable. Stalin couldn't let the Western Allies take Berlin, not after 27 million Soviet citizens had died defeating Germany, not after Stalingrad, Kursk, Leningrad. The Soviet people needed victory. They needed to see their flag over the Reichstag. They needed revenge, and Stalin personally needed it. He'd been humiliated by the German invasion in 1941. His generals had saved Moscow while he paralyzed with fear in his dacha. He'd recovered, but the stain remained. Taking Berlin erased it, so he manipulated Zhukov and Konev's rivalry to accelerate the offensive. He demanded the Reichstag fall before May Day for propaganda purposes. He spent lives like currency because to him, they were currency. From a human standpoint, it was a tragedy shaped by ideology. The Battle of Berlin happened because two totalitarian systems, Nazism and Stalinism, collided. Both systems dehumanized the enemy. Both systems demanded total sacrifice. Both systems valued symbols more than lives. Hitler could have evacuated Berlin. He could have declared it an open city, spared the civilians, ended it. He chose to fight in the ruins because admitting defeat was psychologically impossible. So children died with Panzerfausts. So women were raped. So civilians starved in basements while armies fought over their heads. Stalin could have waited. He could have surrounded Berlin and starved it out, minimized casualties. He chose the direct assault because political competition with the West, with his own generals, mattered more than soldiers' lives. So 81,000 Soviet soldiers died taking a city that would have surrendered anyway within weeks. And then they photographed it. They staged the victory. They edited out the wristwatches. They created the image that would define the war. Because that's what states do. They create narratives. They turn chaos into story. They make meaning out of suffering. The famous photograph of the flag over the Reichstag isn't a lie, exactly. Soviet soldiers did take the Reichstag. They did raise flags. They did win. But the specific image, that image was constructed, posed, edited, crafted for maximum propaganda value. And that tells you everything you need to know about the Battle of Berlin. It was real suffering shaped into a false narrative. It was 500,000 real casualties turned into a symbol. The boy in the trench with tears on his face? Not in the photograph. The women raped by the thousands? Not in the photograph. The soldiers who bled out in the rubble of the Reichstag, fighting for a building that had no military value? Not in the photograph. The photograph shows a flag and a soldier and victory. Clean, simple, heroic. The truth was none of those things. Today, if you visit Berlin, you can see the Soviet War Memorial in Treptower Park. It's enormous. Opened on May 8, 1949, exactly 4 years after Germany's surrender. It contains the graves of 7,000 Soviet soldiers. The centerpiece is a 12-meter bronze statue, a Soviet soldier holding a rescued German child, his sword cutting through a broken swastika. It's based on a possibly apocryphal story about Sergeant Nikolai Masilov, who allegedly braved machine gun fire to rescue a German girl during the fighting. The memorial is beautiful, solemn. It honors real sacrifice. Soviet soldiers did liberate Europe from Nazism. They did defeat Hitler. They did pay the highest price. But locals in Berlin have a different name for it. Some call it the tomb of the unknown rapist. That's the duality. That's the impossible tension. Both things are true. The Red Army defeated Nazi Germany, and the Red Army committed atrocities. Soviet soldiers were heroes, and Soviet soldiers were perpetrators. The memorial is deserved, and the memorial is contested. History isn't clean. Morality isn't simple. The Battle of Berlin proved that, if it proved anything. The Reichstag had no military value. Zero. It was an empty shell, defended by 1,000 German troops who could have been bypassed. But Stalin wanted it. So hundreds of Soviet soldiers died storming it. Hundreds of German soldiers, many of them teenagers, died defending it, for a symbol. This is what happens when leaders value narrative over lives, when the image of victory matters more than the reality of suffering, when propaganda requirements drive military decisions. The lesson: beware leaders who demand symbolic victories at the cost of real lives. For 4 years, Soviet propaganda portrayed Germans as subhuman. Aryans who believed in racial superiority, who had invaded Soviet territory, who had committed horrific atrocities from Babi Yar to the siege of Leningrad. For 4 years, German propaganda portrayed Soviets as subhuman. Asiatic hordes, Bolshevik animals, who threatened Western civilization. When these two dehumanized armies met in Berlin, the result was inevitable: rape, murder, revenge. You cannot teach people that the enemy is subhuman for years, then expect them to treat the enemy humanely when they finally meet. Dehumanization is a tool of war, but it's a tool that cannot be controlled. Once released, it destroys indiscriminately. The lesson: propaganda that dehumanizes the enemy creates atrocities you cannot prevent. Stalin deliberately created competition between Zhukov and Konev. He drew the boundary line, stopping short of Berlin, implicitly creating a race. Why? To accelerate the offensive, to ensure both marshals would push their forces to the limit, trying to be first to the capital. The result? Zhukov's disastrous assault at Seelow Heights, where he committed tank armies against doctrine, costing thousands of lives. Reports of both Soviet fronts intentionally firing on one another in their competition. Ego, personal, national, ideological, drove military decisions that multiplied casualties. The lesson: when leaders manipulate egos for strategic advantage, soldiers pay the price. The Battle of Berlin demonstrated, if any proof was needed, that urban warfare is the worst kind of combat. Every building is a fortress. Every intersection is a kill zone. Civilians and combatants are impossible to distinguish. The environment itself becomes weaponized, subways flooded, buildings collapsed, infrastructure destroyed. Modern militaries study the Battle of Berlin. The tactics Soviet forces used, artillery bombardment, direct tank fire, room-clearing techniques, became doctrine. But so did the lesson that urban warfare is slow, costly, and brutal. The lesson: cities are where military efficiency goes to die, and civilian casualties become inevitable. For decades, Soviet histories presented the Battle of Berlin as a flawless strategic triumph. The assault was brilliant, the casualties were acceptable, the Soviet forces were heroic liberators. The photograph was real. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. Archives opened. Historians like Antony Beevor gained access to documents. Survivors published memoirs. The complexity emerged. The truth was messier. Tactical errors, alcohol-fueled indiscipline, command rivalries, atrocities. The photograph was staged. The official casualty figures were understated. But the truth did emerge. Eventually. Because documentation survives, survivors speak, and historians persist. The lesson: propaganda can shape the immediate narrative, but it cannot erase reality forever. Was the Battle of Berlin worth it? If you were Stalin, yes. You got your victory, your revenge, your photograph. If you were Zhukov or Konev, yes. You secured your place in history. If you were a Soviet soldier who survived and went home, maybe. You defeated Nazi Germany. You avenged your country. The cost was horrific, but the cause was just. If you were a German soldier defending the city, no. You died for a regime that was already finished, on the orders of a leader who'd committed suicide. If you were a Berlin civilian, like Dorothea, or the boy in the trench, or the women who were raped, or the children who starved, absolutely not. You were caught between two armies that saw you as either enemy or irrelevant. Your suffering served no purpose except the egos of distant leaders. The Battle of Berlin was militarily inevitable, strategically unnecessary, and humanly catastrophic. It killed over 500,000 people in 17 days. And then someone staged a photograph and called it Victory, May 8, 1945. Germany surrenders unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. Berlin is ruins. Approximately one-third of the city is destroyed. Infrastructure is devastated. Water systems, electricity, transportation. Bodies lie in the streets, in basements, in collapsed buildings. The smell of decay is everywhere. The population has dropped from 4.4 million in 1939 to 2.8 million in August 1945. Of the survivors, 60% are women. An entire generation of German men has been killed. Soviet forces begin occupation. General Berzarin attempts to restore order, organizing food distribution, restarting water service, imposing inconsistently enforced death penalties for rape and looting. The city is divided into sectors: Soviet, American, British, French. The Cold War is beginning, though no one calls it that yet. Zhukov administers the Soviet occupation of Germany until 1946, when Stalin, jealous of his popularity, sidelines him. He's accused of Bonapartism, taking credit for victories that belonged to Stalin and the Soviet system. He survives, unlike many Soviet generals during the purges, but never commands troops again until after Stalin's death. Konev goes on to suppress the Hungarian uprising in 1956. He dies in 1973, a marshal of the Soviet Union, his rivalry with Zhukov never fully resolved. Weidling dies in Soviet captivity in 1955, having surrendered honorably and refused to participate in post-war Nazi movements. Berzarin dies in a motorcycle accident in June 1945. Some historians suspect it wasn't an accident, that he'd seen too much, knew too much, was too principled. Berlin makes him an honorary citizen in 2003, recognizing his attempts to protect civilians. The boy soldier, if he survived, would have been raised in divided Germany, lived through the Berlin Wall, seen reunification. He'd be in his 90s now. Most likely, though, he died in April or May 1945, another unrecorded casualty. Dorothea von Schwanenflügel escaped to West Germany, then immigrated to America. She married, raised a family, and didn't speak about her experiences for decades. When she finally did, she wrote, "The war came right through our living room." Yevgeny Khaldei, the photographer who staged the famous image, had a long career as a Soviet photojournalist. He covered Stalin's funeral, Khrushchev's rise, Brezhnev's era. He was Jewish. His family had been murdered by Romanian fascists in occupied Ukraine, and he saw photographing Berlin's fall as personal vindication. In 1948, during Stalin's anti-Semitic campaigns, he was fired from his newspaper job. His negatives were confiscated. He spent years in obscurity doing wedding photography to survive. After Stalin's death, he was rehabilitated. His work was recognized. The Reichstag photograph became iconic, one of the defining images of the 20th century. He died in 1997 in Moscow. When asked about the staged nature of the photograph, he said, "It doesn't matter. What matters is we took Berlin. What matters is we won." And maybe he was right. Today, Berlin is a modern city, rebuilt, thriving, the capital of reunified Germany. The scars are mostly gone, though if you know where to look, you can still find them. Bullet holes in building walls, Soviet memorials, the ruins of the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, preserved as a reminder. The Soviet War Memorial in Treptower Park remains. On May 9th, Victory Day, Russians still gather there to commemorate. Old veterans, their chests covered with medals. Younger people holding portraits of relatives who fought. It's contested memory, complicated memory, but it's memory nonetheless. Historians continue to debate the battle. New archives open, new documents emerge. The numbers get refined. Was it 81,000 Soviet dead or 100,000? Was it 92,000 German dead or 100,000? Does it matter? The truth is this. The Battle of Berlin killed over 500,000 people in 17 days to take a city that would have fallen anyway. It was the final act of World War II in Europe, the end of the Third Reich, the beginning of the Cold War. The moment when Soviet soldiers raised a flag, or rather multiple flags, one of which was later staged for photographs, over a building that symbolized German power. And then someone edited the photograph, removing the extra wristwatch, cleaning up the narrative, turning chaos into story. Because that's what we do. We turn suffering into symbol. We turn casualties into numbers. We turn complexity into narrative. The boy in the trench, crying, holding a weapon he didn't want to use. He's not in the history books. The women who were raped. They're not in the history books. The Soviet soldiers who died storming the Reichstag for no military reason. They're not in the history books either. Not individually. What's in the history books is a photograph, a flag, a soldier. Victory? Clean, simple, heroic. The truth was none of those things. But the truth doesn't fit in a photograph. The Battle of Berlin was 17 days in April and May 1945 when 500,000 people died, and then someone staged a photograph and called it victory. Remember both. Remember the suffering, and remember that the image was staged. Because if you only remember the photograph, you've learned nothing.